Sanhedrin Daf Yudalid Amud Aleph and Beis. Leadership is responsible for bad culture. Afילו Nמצא בעליל, לעיר. We're dealing here with the Parsha and Parsha Shoftim of the Eglah Arufa. The situation is ki yimatzeh halal ba'adama asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha lirishta nofel basadeh lo nodar mihikaru. You've got a situation of a dead body is found, it's been murdered out in the fields, nobody knows who the murderer is. V'yatzu zekenecha v'shoftecha u'madedu el ha'arim asher svivot halal. The elders have to go out, and the judges, and they have to measure the distances between the body that was found and the various towns and settlements in the area. V'ya'ir ha'krovah el halal v'lachu ziknei ha'ira hi eglat bakar asher lo u'bad ba asher lo mashcha. Then the elders of that city, that once they've decided that which is the nearest city, the elders of that city have to go through the whole avodah of an eglah arufa, of bringing this calf, and in the process they have to say, "Va'anu v'amru yadeinu lo shafchu et hadam hazeh ve'eineni lo ra'u." Our hands were not responsible for the spilling of this blood, and we didn't see anything. Kaper lamcha Yisrael asher padita. Please Hashem, atone for the nation of Israel, and so on. Says Rashi, El ha'arim asher svivot halal. Why do they need to measure the distance between the body and the surrounding towns? Leida is or krova. You've got to know which is the nearest one. So it's in order to establish data, you need to know the facts. Which is the nearest one? So you've got to measure and see which of the fields is nearest. Says the Mizrahi. The Mizrahi, of all the Perushim on Rashi of the Chumash, the Mizrahi is still the foundational one. The Mizrahi lived in Constantinople in the 15th century. He was a big dayan there. He was a posek. He's known for his Perush on Chumash, which he regarded as his greatest work. But there are also Shilas and Shuvas. He was very involved in Halach. He was involved in many areas in the city of Constantinople at that time. And his Perush on Rashi is still the foundation. You kind of start with the Mizrahi and then you go from there. And he says, Lefichach im hayah halal mutal samuch la'ir. So based on Rashi, where Rashi says that the reason you measure is in order to know which is the town that is closest, if it's obvious which is the town that is closest, if you know without any doubt it's near this particular town and there's no question about that, there's no need for measuring. The purpose of measuring is to establish the facts, to establish proximity. If you can establish proximity without measuring, you don't need to measure, says the Mizrahi based on Rashi. The Bechor Shor shows us that that's unlikely. And even looking at the Posuk, my difficulty with Rashi was from the word Zekenecha v'shoftecha. Who has to measure? If this is about establishing proximity, the Torah should say, get a firm of quantity surveyors and let them measure the distance. Get some engineers to measure the distance. No, who do we get to measure the distance? You get some Rosh Yeshivas from Yerushalayim, from some Poskim from Bnei Brak. We get some old men who are big Talmidei Chachomim, and they've got to measure the distances. Why would you do that? This is, if it's about data, get experts in measuring data. What is a kenecha? Says that the Bechor Shor was a Talmud of Rabbi Tam. So he's in the school of Rashi, of course, and then Rabbi Tam, his grandson, becomes the founder of the whole Tosfos movement. The Bechor Shor was one of the Baalei Tosfos, one of the Talmidim of Rabbi Tam. And he says, not only is it kenecha, we learn from that it's miyuchadim shebiz kenecha. You've got to take the greatest of the Gedolim. Sanhedrin Gedoylo, bring the main Sanhedrin. Whether it's 3 or 5 people, Sanhedri umelech v'kohen gadol. And there's even a day in the Gemara that it's got to be the Sanhedrin and the melech, the king or the nasi, and the kohen gadol all have to go measuring the distance. Why would you trouble them? They're busy with bigger things than measuring the distance between 2 places. What is that about? And the fact that the Bechor Shor brings that, I believe, is to show that this can't just be about, as Rashi says, just leida ezu krova. And in fact, he says, afילו nireh בעליל לעיר. The Bechor Shor says very clearly, and even if it's very clear that it's near one particular town, mitzvah la'asok bimdida, it's still a mitzvah to engage in the activity of medidah, of measuring, in the process of measuring. And that phrase, the Bechor Shor, takes right of our Gemara at the top of Daf Yudalad. We have a brisa where the brisa says, umedado, that you've got, it says in the Torah, and you must measure. She'afilu nמצא בעליל לעיר צריך לעסוק במדידה. Those are the words of the Bechor Shor. He takes from our Gemara. So how can Rashi say the purpose of the measuring is simply to establish proximity when our brisa says very clearly that even if you know the proximity, there's no question, everybody knows this is just a few meters out of the city limits of a particular city or a particular yeshuv. Clearly they're the ones that are responsible. Why would you still need to measure? And Rashi says on our Gemara, it's clear that this is the closest of all the cities. Surely you won't have to, you shouldn't have to do it. So we see, firstly, the fact that the Zakenim do the Medidah. Secondly, you have to do the Medidah, you have to measure even if you know the result. So the purpose of the Medidah is clearly not just to get to the answer. And the Rambam paskins, אפילו נמצא בצד עיר זו שהדבר ידוע בוודאי שהיא הקרבה, mitzvah limdod. Medidah is a mitzvah. It's not just a way of getting to a number. It's not just a way of identifying the city that's most proximate. Measuring is a mitzvah. So what do we do with the Rashi on Chumash and with the Mizrahi? Explains the Mishnah Melech on the Rambam. He says the Mizrahi is very strange. It's against the Brisa. So clearly he says there are two matters, there are two types of measuring. There's a measuring, you've got to know which is the nearest city. So you measure which is the nearest city. But if you know which is the nearest city without measuring, you don't have to measure. But then there's another mitzvah. That's a mitzvah of Medidah, which is not for the purpose of knowing proximity. It's for the mitzvah of Medidah, and that is always there. That mitzvah is always there, whether or not you know the outcome. And he shows it in the Lashon, he shows it in the language of the Mizrahi. And the truth is, even if you look at Rashi on the Chumash is on El Ha'arim Asher Sevivot Halal. His comment on the Dibura Matchil of Rashi, the title of that Rashi is about measuring the cities that are around the dead body. So Rashi is talking about why do you need to measure all the cities? You need to measure all the cities to know which is the nearest one. When you know which is the nearest one, you measure the nearest one, and that nearest one becomes responsible. The question is, what is the Torah trying to teach us? That you've got to measure even if you know the answer. Understand it's a mitzvah, it's a gzeres hakosov, that's what the Torah says you've got to do. Understand where it comes from. But why? Why would that be? It seems such an absurd thing to take these people who are learning Torah, who are paskening halacha, you've got the Melech, you've got the Kohen Gadol according to that day, and the Sanhedrin are coming out to measure when you know the answer. It just doesn't make sense. But this ties into the Tel Zerov that we learned on Daf Yud Aleph. On Daf Yud Aleph, we learned the principle with all these people who got up and took responsibility for activities that they weren't really responsible for. And the Tel Zerov says there's no such thing as not responsible for. Whatever happens, we are responsible for even for the moods of other people. We are responsible for the feelings of other people. We are responsible for the status and the stature of the people around us. If we are as great as we could be, you'll remember, as we should be, then other people would be as great as they could be. That if something is missing, if something is lacking among the people of our communities, the leaders and the participants of that community share some of that. Because if we were where we need to be, other people would be where they need to be as well. There's some inadequacy in our capacity to radiate a level of greatness that would make it impossible for other people to sin around us, because that would be the culture that we create around us. And if things are happening in our communities that aren't in order, we've got to look inwards. We've got to say, what is it what responsibility do we have in that? Says the Ibn Ezra, if it weren't for the fact that that town did something wrong similar to this murder, it wouldn't have happened in their vicinity. Yes, the murder happened, the Rebbeinu Shem wanted this person to die at that time, but it didn't have to be there. The fact that it happened there is an indicator something's wrong with the culture of the city. And that's a pointer. When something goes wrong in a community, when something goes wrong in a city, when something goes wrong in a business, when something goes wrong in a country, You have to look at the culture that's developed, because people's actions are not only the function of their own choice. Of course, there is their own choice and they're fully accountable for their own choices. But there's also an environment that spawns bad attitude. There's an environment that spawns faulty values. There's an environment that spawns bad choices and bad actions. And who's responsible for that? Says the Yerushalmi, Lo hayu modedim ela me'ir sheyesh ba beit din. It has to be a town with a Beis Din. If there's no Beis Din, you don't do this whole thing. Because somebody has to take responsibility. Who takes responsibility? The Gedolei Hador. They have to take responsibility. And imagine if only we saw more of that even today. We spoke about that on Daf Yud Aleph. If we saw more of that from our Torah leadership, certainly from our other leadership, but from our Torah leadership, that instead of merely looking at what's wrong in the country and how people are doing wrong, to be able to take more responsibility and say, as Torah leadership, what are we doing wrong that is creating a culture in which people can be so undermining of Yiddishkeit? What kind of Yiddishkeit are we projecting? What kind of Torah lives are we projecting? What kind of Torah personalities are we projecting that is arousing hatred in people? Those people are responsible for their own decisions. We can't take the responsibility away from them. But something we're doing has to be wrong as well. It says the Ibn Ezra, Kilulei she'asu avera kedumela lo nizdamen adam she'hareg karov mehem. And therefore the Gemara says in Soita, we have the same piece of Gemara in Soita, and it goes into much greater detail. Ein egla arufa ba'a ela bishvil tzarei ha'ayin. Says the Gemara, and I'll tell you what they did wrong. It's tsarus ayin. Tsarus ayin is meanness. There's a culture of meanness. What does that mean? Says the Gemara there, when the leaders of the town say, we're not responsible, what they mean is, Lo bali yadenu ufetranuhu belo mezonot, lo ra'inu v'nichu belo levaya. We didn't see this person leaving the town, because if we would have seen the person leaving the town, we would have given him food so that he wouldn't have had to drag around looking for food, and we would have sent people with him. And the idea of levaya is really interesting, because the mitzvah of levaya, even when in situations where you do it with guests at your home, you see the guest out, but you're not going to see him all the way. Levaya doesn't mean you have to see him to the next town. But if a person's going to New York, levaya doesn't mean you've got to get onto the plane with him and go with him to New York. Levaya means you see him off, you go with him some of the way. Why? Because when a person leaves your house or your town or your community, there's always a kind of a funny feeling. You say goodnight, the host closes the door, and one of the things that crosses the mind of a guest often is, I wonder what they're saying now after they close the door. Joey, we didn't say anything last night after we closed the door. What are they saying about us after I was like, at last they left. Are they saying, what a draining evening? Are they saying, what crazy people? Who knows what they're saying? They were very nice to us when we were in the house, but now that we've left, who knows what they're saying? But you see somebody out, you show them kavod on the way out. You take them to the elevator, you take them downstairs. That's a different thing. Then you realize this is somebody who's mechabed us. This is somebody who's showing us kavod. And when you're shown kavod, you walk with a different confidence, you walk with a different dignity. And say the Gedolim of that town, we would have seen him off and shown him kavod, so that he wouldn't have been seen by the criminals as easy game. But it goes further than that, says the Maharal. It's not that this person was killed because he didn't have food. It's not that the person was killed because they didn't have levaya. The person was killed by ayin hara. Ayin hara, explains the Maharal, is the creation of vacuousness that results from the energy a mean person projects. A mean person is vacuous. He doesn't want to give anything away. He wants to keep everything for himself because he's empty inside. And that inner emptiness causes an outer emptiness, a vacuousness, and a negativity. He dies from tzarei ayin, says the Maharal. The Gemara says there, what is it? Ein egla rufa ba ela bishvil tzarei ha'ayin. It doesn't say ein egla ba ela because they didn't give them food. Egla Arufa happens because they didn't see them off. They didn't accompany them on the way. It's a tsarus ayin. There's a bad culture in the town. There's a culture of tsarus ayin. And who's responsible for bad culture? The leadership is responsible for bad culture. And Rabbeinu Bechor says, and you see from there also, when people see these Gedolei Yisrael measuring distances and they're busy, the whole Sanhedrin is there, they'll realize how seriously the Torah takes one person, one missing soul. A person was set alight and killed in a subway in New York a few days ago. Nobody knows who she is. Nobody's even come to claim her. Nobody knows who she is. And there's an interesting thing that the New York leadership is saying. What is it about our city that allows this to happen? So that's good. At least they're looking at what is it allows it to happen. But there's much more than that. What the Torah requires the leaders to look is what is the culture? What is the midot that we're spawning? Why is there such sarut ayin in our city? And this is something we need to take care of, whether we're leading families or we're leading communities or organizations or cities or countries. As leaders, we're responsible for the culture. A good culture can spawn ma'asim tovim, can spawn the most amazing good deeds. And a rotten culture can spawn such destructiveness, such negativity, for which not only is the person who does the negative action responsible, but so are the leaders who develop a culture that allows such things to take place. And likewise, when the culture is positive and the culture brings about positive outcomes, that's something the leaders can take credit for.